Hola.
Hello. Hello, how is everybody? Good evening. Thank you very much to everyone for coming along. I want to welcome you on behalf of the foundation, Espacio, and my name is Pablo Gonzalo. I work in the digital culture area in Telefónica. We're delighted to present to you a new event in our series on which we are introducing in collaboration with the Aspen Institute and the Telefónica Foundation, and it's a program that will last the whole year, where we're exploring how this digital revolution is affecting all the different aspects of society, culture and economy. We are starting off the program with Ryan Avent. We started it off with the economist, writer, talking about the future of the labour market and how it was evolving, and the work that's done, what's available on the web. And then we continue with Dario Gil, who's the Vice President of IBM internationally, and he was talking about the revolution which artificial intelligence is all about, what it represents. And then we had Coniol, who talked to us about education and the new models of learning. So all these conferences, if you weren't able to come, you have them available on the website. For the program, I can give you the address. It's Aspen fundaciontelefonica.com, okay? aspen.fundaciontelefonica.com. You also have the hashtag Tech Society, where we debate on all the subjects of the program. So you can also hear it on streaming and ask questions to the speaker. So I won't talk much longer. I simply want to thank Eli Pariser for coming along today, and thanks to you for being here, and thanks to the whole team of the foundation who've made this possible, and also to thank the whole team of Aspen Institute who have made it possible to have our speaker here today. So before we continue with Eli, I'll give the floor to David Vlasquez from Aspen so that he can introduce our speaker. Okay, thank you very much.
En todas las sesiones.
In the first sessions, this is the first time that Pablo's got some applause. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. I know that some people are not keen on air conditioning, but we've had lots of interviews today with Eli, and it's been fascinating to hear what he has to say, and we want to have more and better questions on the subject that he's been asked about. So I don't know if you've been following the other sessions in our program. My job here is to invite you to come and look at the web pages, the YouTube, etc. You will see that there is a fantastic pattern here that has a lot of sense to it. So we're going to get into the question that Eli is an absolute expert on, and has been kind enough to publish the book through Taurus, the publishing house, which is very, very important. So you'll see Eli on the website. You'll have probably looked at the website to get to know him, but apart from being the author of this book and directing a website called where we've really insisted, it's got particularly significant content there, and he's an executive move on and one of the founders of Abad. So you'll see him on in that information. So Eli, thank you very much for coming along. Eli Pariser, I think we're translating what is being said, so please go ahead. We look forward to hearing from you.
Hi everybody. ¿Qué tal? That's the complete Spanish that I know, so I apologize for speaking in English. But it's a real honor to be here today and to talk with you. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the filter bubble is, how my thinking on it has evolved since I started thinking about this 6 years ago, and then what we might do to to get out of it and to challenge some of these dynamics that I'm about to talk about. But let's start with what is the filter bubble? So for me, this started. This journey started sometime in 2010, and it was on a morning when I logged on to Facebook, and I had just gone through this, this process of trying to meet people who thought differently from me. I tend to be kind of on the left politically. In Europe, you would say center because I'm an American, I really wanted to meet people who were going to challenge my thinking. And so I had actually gone around and kind of made some new friends, and I had added them on Facebook. And so on this particular morning, I logged onto Facebook, and I was expecting to see something like this, with my liberal and conservative friends all, happily interchanging ideas, one after the other. But that wasn't what I saw at all. Without asking me about it, Facebook had looked at my behavior patterns. It had looked at which links I was clicking and which links I wasn't clicking. It had looked at who I was interacting with more. And it had decided that, yeah, Eli, I know you say that you want to get to know some people who think differently from you, but we really can see your behavior. And so without asking me about that, Facebook edited them out. They disappeared from my field of view. And I thought, this is interesting because, Facebook is an increasingly important medium. And if this is happening to me after all of this effort, I wonder what's happening to the, then hundreds of millions of other people who are on this platform. And what might happen if this was the way that people were seeing news. So I started doing some research, and I found a blog post from Google. And as it turns out, Facebook isn't the only media company or the only platform rather, that is looking at our behavior and using data about us to control what we see. To my surprise, Google is as well. So it is no longer the case that when you Google something, the results that you get are the same as the results that other people get. In fact, a Google engineer told me there are 57 different signals that Google uses to tailor its responses to you. And some of those are about your personal data, but even before it gets to your personal data, Google is looking at things like where you're sitting and what computer you're using and what browser you're using to create a kind of sense of who you might be, and then to show you results that are kind of appropriate for who it thinks you are. And when I first heard about this, I sort of wondered, is this just a kind of PR push or some kind of marginal idea? So I actually asked my friends, this was in the middle of the Arab Spring, to Google Egypt and send me screenshots of what they saw. So my friend Scott Googled Egypt and sent me this screenshot. And my friend Daniel, who's also in his 30s in New York, a professional, Googled Egypt and sent me this screenshot. And when you put them side by side, you don't even have to kind of read the content to see that these are two pretty different views of the world. But when you do read the content, it gets even more interesting because when Scott Googled Egypt, he got a lot of information about the Arab Spring. But Daniel didn't see anything about the Arab Spring. That wasn't anywhere on the first page of results that Daniel got. That could have been interesting if he had decided to take a vacation to Egypt at that time. It would have been a little unexpected. I think what's doubly interesting about this is that neither of them could really understand or explain why they got the results that they did. What was different about Scott versus Daniel that meant that one of them was getting these political results and the other one was not? And then I kind of came across this quote from Eric Schmidt, who was then the CEO of Google. And he said, "It'll soon be very hard for people to watch or consume something that is not, in some sense, tailored for them." And so I thought, what does it look like when we live in a media environment in which everything that we see has been personalized for us? And this image kind of came to mind. So on the outside here, we have a whole sort of panoply of ideas and ways of thinking and concepts. But then there's this membrane of algorithms that are using our personal data to decide what information they think we want to see. And only the information that sort of meets those criteria gets through into our information environment. And so the filter bubble is this kind of personalized universe of information just for us that follows us around on the web. And as you can see, it's not just Google and it's not just Facebook, but increasingly it's a lot of different websites, including a lot of news websites that look at what data we're interested in and make decisions about which stories we're going to see and which stories we're going to not see. Now, you might say, media has always done this. Media has always sort of played to what it thinks we want to hear. But I think what's new about this is that this is a passive process. We don't know who Google or Facebook or any of these algorithms think we are. And we don't know on what basis they're editing information in or letting information through. And therefore, we don't really have a sense of what we're missing. We don't have a sense of what's being edited out. So this was sort of the starting point for this book. And I think by the time I had kind of finished researching and writing it, I came to another conclusion, which is that I had grown up in the kind of, late 90s, early 2000s, believing this kind of mythology about the internet. And the mythology went something like this. That in the pre-internet world, there were these people called gatekeepers. And they were editors and they were producers, and they decided unilaterally what information got out to the public. And this was a bad thing in some cases because these gatekeepers were sometimes corrupt. They sometimes, took bribes in order to let information out. They were friends with the people in power. And so when the internet came along, it swept them out of the way. And all of a sudden, we could all communicate with each other. It was a new era of democracy, and everything was perfect. What I realized was, this isn't what's happened at all. What's happened is that there's a new set of gatekeepers. And they're not people, they're code. But the code is performing a lot of the same tasks that those people were. It's deciding what information enters our consciousness. But we haven't yet, sort of figured out how to hold that code accountable. We haven't figured out how to talk about the important role that that code is playing. And so, that's kind of the core of my argument in the filter bubble. And if you read the book, which I recommend, there's a lot of more kind of examples and detail and ways that this kind of plays out. But that's the core of it. So what's happened since this all, since I wrote the original draft in 2011? It's been 6 years later. Well, the first thing that's happened is that those new gatekeepers, they're now way bigger and way stronger. And this chart, which shows Facebook's growth, the little arrow points to when I started doing research for the book, actually kind of understates the degree to which Facebook is bigger, because this is just the number of monthly active users that Facebook has. Since then, but also people are spending an enormously larger amount of time per user. So if you really imagine, sort of the total amount of attention that we're spending, it's probably an order of magnitude more attention that people are spending with Facebook than they were in 2011. And I think the second piece is, the filter bubble has become a bigger conversation. This is the Google Trends chart for searches about the filter bubble, which is sort of a weird self-reflexive thing if you think about it for a second. This line up here is sort of the maximum number of searches. It's a relative chart. And so you see these huge spikes recently, which mainly is about this guy. It's driven a lot of conversation about the filter bubble. After his election especially following kind of Brexit, there was a lot of kind of questions about the filter bubble, and it became this much bigger part of the conversation. So a lot of different sort of media outlets and people, sort of articulating that this might be a problem. And some of these, suggested even that Trump's victory was a result of the filter bubble. Maybe, these conservatives were only seeing what they wanted to hear in social media, and that's what led him to victory. Now, for what it's worth, I don't actually think that that's the case. And I don't think that for a couple of reasons. First off, if you think about who Trump's voters were, they were older white guys without a college education in the middle of the United States. These are not actually, large Twitter users. Like, that's not who is on these platforms by and large. They will be, but it's not the group of people who are mostly on social media. And so I actually think sort of traditional media played a larger role in helping him reach those voters than social media did. But I do think that there was a filter phenomenon in the election. And really, I think what it was about was that for journalists and for educated elites, the filter bubble made it easy for them to ignore some of the realities of what living in the middle of America is like right now, and made it possible for them to forget the stresses and the pressures and the racism that might lead someone like Trump to be appealing to a large group of people. It allowed us to, sort of live in a bubble on the American coast and not really experience that reality. And so while I don't think that the election itself was driven by the filter bubble, I think that the surprise that we all had and the fact that, so many people thought it was just, a cakewalk for Hillary Clinton, of course she was going to be the next president. I think that was driven by this lack of awareness by people who were heavy social media users who like to think of ourselves as actually pretty, well connected and pretty enlightened. But we were in a bubble ourselves. So I think that's the first, sort of reflection that I have, looking back. The second one is that, in my initial conception of the filter bubble, I thought of it as this kind of process where you have a bunch of stories. Some of those stories get selected for any given person to appear in their newsfeed or to appear in their awareness. And it's kind of this one-way process. And what I didn't really realize was that the system was going to become sentient. It was going to become self-aware. And that increasingly, the people who made media, who made stories, were going to be making them with the express purpose of getting into and reinforcing people's filter bubbles. So I think this is where this kind of fake news phenomenon comes in, because the people who made fake news, and if you're not familiar with Pizzagate, you're lucky, but it was this really crazy conspiracy theory that circulated during the election that Hillary Clinton maybe was running a child sex slavery operation out of a pizza parlor. This kind of crazy stuff worked because it was designed to make it through these algorithmic gauntlets just to specific populations. And so I think the fake news phenomenon is a function of media companies realizing that they can tailor their stories to fit these algorithms and to fit this kind of personalization. And, I've been working on some of these topics as well. I after the election, tweeted out a few ideas of how we might solve this fake news problem. How, if you were Facebook, what might you do from a technical level that would solve fake news? And I tweeted 3 or 4 ideas in a Google Doc and encouraged people to add their ideas. And it was sort of amazing. It spread and spread. Soon there were Google engineers and Facebook engineers and people all over the globe contributing. And now it's this, 160-page document that someone went in and actually made this table of contents for. I had nothing to do with that. That talks about how you might deal with fake news. But when we think about, sort of the problems with our information ecosystem, I do think it goes beyond fake news. And I really think, it comes down to that the truth isn't loud enough right now. And that you could take away fake news from the American election and still have a pretty distorted and warped conversation in which we're spending a lot of attention on things that are not very consequential and not very much attention on things that are really the most consequential. And I think the other piece is that those truths about what's happening with the American middle class have kind of faded out of our view. We don't have to pay attention to them. They're not very clicky. They're not very fun to engage with. And so the algorithms downrank them until they recede from our awareness. So I think all of this is to say that, this is a phenomenon that is emerging, but it hasn't yet fully emerged. And I actually think if you look at 2016, in some ways it was more a story about Trump's ability to get the mainstream media to tell his story than about Trump's ability to manipulate social media. But here's the thing. This is coming. And I sort of feel like it's like the event horizon of a black hole. We don't totally know what is going to, what a fully social media driven media ecosystem looks like yet. We're still actually before that happens, and we're still at a place where a lot of people are not getting their news that way. But I think, the trends are pretty strong, and the trends are going to take us toward people experiencing a lot of their news through these mediums. And I think we really need to think about sort of what is that going to look like and feel like, and what is that going to do to our societies. And then I think the last piece, in case everyone was not like unsettled and worried enough, let me just add another piece of this, which is, the emergence of AI that will amplify these personalization tendencies. So there was recently a study that a group of Chinese researchers did where they took a whole group of photos of men and they knew which of the men in the future were going to be convicted of crimes. And they asked the AI to guess, just based on their photos, which people were going to be criminals and which ones were not. And they got to something like a 90% accuracy rate at guessing who was going to be convicted of a crime. Now, I think thinking about this study is really important because there's a right way and a wrong way to understand it and to read it. The wrong way is that AI can tell who breaks the law. We don't know anything from this study about whether AI can tell who breaks the law. What we know from this study is who the criminal justice system decides is guilty. But those are very different concepts, because one of them might actually bake in a whole bunch of prejudices or assumptions about people, maybe even based on how they look, that that has nothing to do with whether they're criminal. And I think this is one of the challenges as we move into these kinds of systems, is it's very easy to pretend that an algorithm is fair when essentially what it's doing is sort of reproducing or even strengthening existing societal biases. Maybe what this is picking up on is that judges in China are prejudiced against people who look a certain way, and therefore you can guess very accurately that people who look that way are going to be convicted of crimes. But that doesn't say anything about, we should just substitute this algorithm for the criminal justice system. So what can we do about it? And then, by the way, I don't have an answer to this particular piece of it, but I do have some thoughts on what we can do about the rest of this. So the first piece, and I think this is a really positive development, is that these platforms are paying attention. When the book first came out, Facebook and Google really said, like, this is not an issue, this is not a thing. And I've been gratified to see, especially since the election, that Mark Zuckerberg and other folks at Facebook, are beginning to invest in, pieces of technology deliberately designed to help expose people to different ideas. So they rolled out this thing. A few weeks ago, that before you read an article, you might see other articles that have a different point of view. That's a pretty good intervention. And I think there are ways, without kind of forcing people to consume content that we don't want to consume, to remind us that we are seeing a pretty slanted or tailored view of the world, and that there are other views that are available. And I think there are other tech leaders who are joining in this. Jimmy Wales, actually, this was just from yesterday or the day before, has been calling on Facebook to show people news that they don't agree with. So I think there's this growing momentum that actually the platforms have a responsibility to do something about this. And I think that that's pretty exciting. And I think that as consumers, we need to keep the heat on them because, I think they are responsive to feedback and they understand sort of I think consumers are starting to understand the central role that these platforms play in our information ecosystem and demand more of them. And especially in Europe, I can say, without a doubt, because I'm meeting with the head of policy for Facebook tomorrow, they're very, very concerned about European regulators coming in and telling them what to do or what not to do. And so actually pressure from you all in particular, is especially noted by them. I think the second piece is, how do we use these platforms to actually build cross-group connections? And this is, what we've been trying to work on at Upworthy, which is how do we tell stories that build empathy across groups? This was a story that we ran that was about a Muslim girl who was, traumatized by a Trump rally that she saw on TV where he was talking very forcefully about, the Muslim population. And after she went to sleep that night, her mom posted on Facebook and said, I don't like that my daughter is scared to be a Muslim here in America. And someone who was an acquaintance who was in the military, posted her photo in her uniform and said, show this to your daughter and let her know that, we are here to protect her and to protect her right to be here. And, that woman's friends then saw that post, and soon you had hundreds of folks in the military who were kind of coming to tell her that there were a bunch of people who were going to stand up for her right to be a Muslim in America. And what I think this story helps do is challenge some assumptions, on a number of levels. It gives you an insight into the experience of what it's like to be a Muslim if you're not, which most of Americans are not. But it also kind of it presents this in a way that's sort of apolitical and patriotic, and which folks who might be Trump supporters, can engage with. It's not, shaming people for voting for him. It's just talking about the experience of this girl. So I think the storytelling piece, using stories to build empathy, we know that the number one best way to increase cross-group connections is by actually, getting together with someone in person who you disagree with and you find, okay, actually, I don't hate you. But the second best way is to hear a story about a specific person in a group that you have a stereotype about, and that really reduces bias. And so that's, I think, another tool. The third one is finding spaces where we can have good cross-group conversations. And researchers have been looking at this, and they found it in a really interesting place. So the question was, where on the internet are people actually having kind of somewhat respectful and thoughtful political conversations? And it turns up in a very unlikely place, which is on sports forums, which is not normally a place that's associated with respectful and thoughtful. But sports forums actually make a lot of sense because if we're all New York Yankees fans, which is what this board is about, then we have a shared identity that kind of supersedes our political identity. And because we're all members of the same tribe and we're all rooting for the same team, we can have a conversation without it kind of threatening who we are. And so I actually think finding these spaces that are not political, where we can kind of connect across groups, is a really important piece of the process. And the fourth piece is that, we know that trust in media has been declining. And I would argue it's been declining for some good reasons. Both the business models of media have increasingly, sort of blurred the lines between advertising and editorial in a way that people understand intuitively. But I would also say, I think the idea of why people should trust media in the first place has rested on kind of a faulty premise. So when I talk to journalists, they'll say, well, people should trust us because we're doing our homework, we're finding the facts, we're finding the truth, and, that's the basis for our trust. And what I say to them is, look, trust is not about who has the best process. Tell me someone in your life who you deeply trust because they've got a great process. We trust people because we believe that they have our best interests at heart. And then we want to make sure that they're competent. But if we don't believe that they actually care about us or have our best interests at heart, then there's no amount of sort of due diligence that they're going to do that's going to make us want to affiliate with them. So I think, this is a big project, which is how do we ensure that media actually rebuild that trust by actually showing people that they do have their best interests at heart. And I think, frankly, in the United States, there's a lot of media that would kind of claim to speak for the whole country, but truly doesn't care about a bunch of the folks who voted for Trump who might be susceptible to fake news. And without someone filling that vacuum, then you're going to find a bunch of actors who come in and do, who maybe don't have the best motives. So, I think these are 4 possible solutions, with the platforms, with storytelling, with building new spaces and rebuilding trust. And often, when I'm talking about this, and I'll close on this note, people ask me, like, is there reason for hope? And I think, that comes from this deep, almost despair, which is this sense of, we're sliding back as a civilization into this kind of tribal form, tribal antagonism, different tribes having different ways of knowing and not being able to talk to each other. And that feels very compelling because the roots of that are very deep. They go back to the beginning of civilization. And if what Facebook and Google are doing is activating or playing on these tribal impulses, like, how are we going to rise above that? Is that possible? And because I'm a American naive idealist, I'll say, yeah, it is possible, actually. And in fact, what we've seen is that the history of civilization is the history of us finding technologies that allow us either to rise above our tribal tendencies or to channel them into projects that are non-zero-sum games where we're actually building something better together. And I think if we can do that in the real world, if we can build a global civilization, despite huge differences between people, despite huge differences in ways of thinking, then certainly we can do that online, on Facebook and in these other new media. So I think that's the task in front of us. And it's not a small task, but I think it's absolutely an achievable task. So I really thank you for your attention. I think we're going to have a great conversation. I look forward to hearing from all of you. But thank you for coming out and hearing what I have to say.
¿Todos? ¿Se me escucha? Sí. Yo soy Esther Paniagua.
Can you hear me? Hello, I'm Esther Paniagua. I'm a journalist. And I'm very thankful for you to be here. We hope that this conversation is interesting. You'll have room for questions in the end. So you can follow us in streaming. Hello to all of you who are following us on streaming. And you can post questions on Twitter with the hashtag TechSociety, and you can tweet on everything that we are saying. Thank you.
Talk about, and I think you were visionary, speaking out these things 6 years ago. So I'm gonna switch to Spanish, so it's easier for the people here and the online audience to follow the conversation. Okay, we can have a seat. Me gustaría.
I would like to support something that you've said about something that you don't think that the fake news, its impact, well, the fake news could have this impact in the result of the US election with Donald Trump's victory. And it is true that the University of Stanford, in a study of a couple of months ago, determined that this impact had not been such. And most of the people, as you have said, were informed of the campaign by TV. But this study said that people tend to believe fake news that support their way of thinking. And especially, this impact is bigger when news come from segregated social networks. As you have been able to check, for example, Facebook has this segregation effect. I would like to get a little bit deeper into the impact that the fake news and bubble filters have, because I mean that there are some studies that are a little bit contradictory, or that go in line of the limited effects theory that we have already tackled in 1940 with different communication experts about the limited effects of media. The first study is of Facebook researchers. It could be a little bit biased, and it was published on the online science website, and it proved that the timeline news have a feedback effect, but this effect is not as important as we believe. They say that the possibility of receiving news that are opposed to our way of thinking, or transversal political news, were just 1% less than if we didn't have this echo effect, or feedback effect as we want to call it, or this segregation. Another effect that was studied by the business school from the University of Chicago about the segregation impact on the internet, it said that people, online people, go to news portal aggregators, sites like many websites, and when they get out of there, they don't go to places where the people from their communities are. So I'm gonna get to the question. If you do really think that these results make sense, and how does this affect the bubble filters in terms of information determinism that you tackle in your book? And the effect I have noted down, the effect of the friendship syndrome that maybe you want to explain. How does this affect?
So a lot there. And let me just take this off so that I can. Let's talk about the Facebook study first. So, they have their spin on it, and I have mine. I think they would say, well, it's undoubtedly true that who your friends are has a greater influence on what you see than the algorithm. And that sort of is almost obvious in the sense of, Facebook isn't going to provide me with news or information that wasn't posted by someone I know, and therefore that's sort of the input for anything that appears in my news feed. The second piece that's important to note is that the amount of hard news that people consume is actually much lower than most of us imagine it would be. So for a lot of people, you're not talking about a huge amount of sort of political news input, and then the likelihood that the algorithm is going to have an effect on that is smaller. But what the study did say is that actually the effect that the algorithm has in amplifying what you see is about as significant as the effect of what you choose to click on out of the choices that you have, which is pretty significant. I mean, I think, if you ask people, like, do your own choices of what you click on in Facebook, matter to what you end up consuming, they would say, yes, that does matter. And it was exactly about, that amount of effect that the algorithm increases your likelihood to see things that you already agree with. So I would say that's a significant amplification effect, and I would say that it's even more significant among audiences that are going to consume a lot of news. So basically, the more interested you are in politics, the more likely you are to have this effect and to have it be significant, because that's kind of outweighed by a lot of people who have a relatively low interest and aren't seeing a ton of effect. And so I think that's what I would suggest about the Facebook study. The University of Chicago piece sort of gets to my first point in a way, which is that we're not fully in a Facebook-mediated world yet. And it is true that still a lot of people go to general news websites and come away with a fairly sort of mainstream or both sides point of view. But if you look at the traffic, Facebook is going essentially straight up, and those sites are going essentially straight down. Especially if you look at the portion of their traffic that isn't mediated through Facebook, essentially. And so I think if you had to bet on, are people in 10 years going to be loading, sort of a general purpose news aggregator, or are they going to be loading a personalized site like Facebook? I'm happy to kind of put money on that bet. Was there another piece or, okay, great, yeah. This stuff, when you really get into the science of it, is complex because you're dealing with many different populations. This is one of the challenges of understanding sort of how algorithms work is you can have this, to some degree, when you talk to engineers at Facebook and Google, they'll say, look, dude, we don't even know how it works. We can't explain what it's doing in any given case. We just know sort of that in general you put these things in and you get these things out. That's further exacerbated by the fact that the shape of networks on the left is different than the shape of networks on the right. So you could have the exact same algorithm and it would have different effects because the nature of people's relationships is different. So the point is, it is a hard phenomenon to study accurately, and that's made doubly hard by the fact that Facebook absolutely will not allow people externally to study it without saying, that they're willing to not publish their results. And so it's a black box. We don't really have a lot of good data other than their one study, which I would argue, shows that this effect is real.
¿Podrías explicar?
Could you explain how the friendship syndrome is about? It's something that you mentioned in your book. Friendly syndrome or something like that. Friendly syndrome. She said, that's what she said.
Yeah, sorry. So I think, there was a hypothesis in sort of 1980s media study that, because news producers found that they basically could get a lot of people to tune in if they showed fires or car crashes or, sort of violence, that led to everyone leading with, if it bleeds, it leads. And that in turn gave people an impression that the world was more violent than it actually is. And I think the premise in the book was, in some ways we now have the reverse where, because we click on things that make us feel good, that we may only see things that sort of confirm our biases. But on reflection, I want to kind of adjust the idea a little bit because I think I didn't realize when I was writing the book how good it makes people feel to see that other people who they dislike are wrong. And that's actually a lot of what the content is that is doing very well virally is it's, you get to feel good about the other side losing. So I don't know that's not exactly a friendly world. That's kind of a you're right and they're wrong world, which might be the world that we're living in now.
Interesante. Hablas también de un par de conceptos.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of concepts that I would like to tackle. You say that the bubble filters affect the cognitive balance and the creation discovery. So this is really important. So why this happen? Why?
Yeah, so I think one of the underlying premises here is that whether deliberately or not, these platforms have come to understand things about our cognition that we don't necessarily understand. And one of the things that they recognize and that these algorithms kind of build in is that generally people, the more familiar you are with an idea or a concept, the more comfortable you are with it, the better you feel about it. And cognitively, we really are driven toward sort of simplicity and especially simple answers that reaffirm that we're on the right track or we're right. And so I think that the danger there is that, to grow and to learn, actually requires being exposed to ideas that challenge our existing mental structures and that challenge the ways that we're thinking about things and that force us to reevaluate. And that's such a critical process, both to understanding the world and to coming up with new ideas. And I think there's another piece of this, which is that these algorithms especially will tend to expose us only to things sort of in a pretty narrow domain. So think about, Netflix and, if I show Netflix that I'm interested in horror movies, it's just going to kind of keep showing me the newest horror movies. But that may not be the sum total of everything that I'm interested in. And if you only rely on my past behavior, then you're never going to expose me to drama or romantic comedy or whatever it is. And so I think if creativity is a function of kind of reaching beyond your usual domains, these algorithms can actually kind of narrow what inputs you get and therefore how creative you might be.
Volviendo al tema de las fake news.
So getting back to the fake news, and especially what you say about the situations that we are in a point where this is just getting started, in my opinion, there's a feedback or circular effect with bubble filters with fake news, because you read what you receive after filtering, you click on the fake news, they come viral, there are more people that receive them. And on the other hand, there's something interesting, and this is that companies invest increasingly on online and automatic ads. So this means that these ads suddenly appear on fake news websites without even the companies knowing it. And maybe they wouldn't want them to be there, but this at the same time makes a feedback of the value. So why do they appear there? Because on social networks, these news have a higher participation than the ones that are not fake news, or at least this is what BuzzFeed used to say. That is a website specialized in viral news. They say that these news have more participation, even that at the end of Trump's campaign there were more news of this type on social networks than non-fake news. So taking into account this vicious circle and the fact that these news are the most profitable ones eventually, how can this affect the future towards we are going? So will these news be more important? What can we do in that respect? And I will always also like to link this with a topic that these fake news are are a reason of concern during election time. We were talking about France, the second round in France. There's an initiative that is called Cross-Check, where media, different journalists and companies like Facebook, etc., are working to verify news. Do you think that this is enough? Because the Facebook shareholders are pushing the company to find a solution, because they say that this is not enough, that this is affecting its reputation, that it can affect political policies. I know I'm mixing up many things. I would like to know your opinion, and with this we will give the floor to the audience.
So let's start with some terminology, which is, I think fake news can mean many different things to many different people. Clearly means something different to the President of the United States than it does to me. I think there's one sort of definition of it that is someone sort of fraudulently borrowing the design of a journalistic website in order to, put together a story that is factually false, and then but designed to be spreadable, and then get a lot of distribution for it. I think that's a problem, but I also think in a way it's a red herring. That may be an idiom that doesn't translate, but it's a distraction, and it kind of takes people off the path that we need to follow, because I I think the platforms will find ways to crack down on things that are actually false, that have no sort of pre-existing credibility. But I don't think that solves the problem of misinformation at all. And I think if you look at where the vast amount of misinformation came from, it wasn't people saying things that were necessarily 100% false or even sort of technically false at all. You know, a lot of the things that left the wrong impression were things that were factually true, but designed in a way to mislead people or to lead them to a factually untrue conclusion. And that's a much deeper and more problematic issue, and one that is harder, you know, for platforms or users to address, but I think one that's more central. So my view is, you know, you could get rid of Pizzagate and you could get rid of all this stuff, and you wouldn't have a substantial difference in the U.S. election unless you looked at the sort of gray area of you know, stories that have the wrong, you know, that leave people with an impression that's incorrect, even if they're factually honest. I think, you know, that's sort of what I mean when I say the truth isn't loud enough, which is, I think the project, civilizationally, is to make sure that that when there are stories that have gone through this rigorous process of, you know, journalistic truth finding, that they are then put in a package where they will be competitive on Facebook. Because I think one of the dynamics of Facebook is that, you know, I think media outlets still kind of think of themselves as competing with each other, and you're really not. Like, you're competing with your uncle's picture of your cousin and, you know, some guy like surfing off his roof. And that's the competition for reaching an audience with a news story. And so how do you build truthful stories in a way that are resonant and competitive in that environment? That seems to me like a critical piece of the equation.
So do you agree? ¿Estás de acuerdo?
So, this was the last part of the question, and it was about what do you think about the efforts that these companies are doing to try to minimize this impact? Just briefly, if you can.
I think it's a start, but not enough. I mean, I think that you know, the thing that seems most one of the things that Facebook is doing is it's just saying, if a bunch of independent fact checkers say this isn't true, we're not going to stop people from sharing it, but we're going to pop up a little box that says, a bunch of people say this is not true. Are you sure you want to share it? And that turns out to reduce sharing a lot, without sort of being prohibitive of people being able to do what they want on the platform. So I think that's a pretty good type of step, but I don't think that we're anywhere near solving the problem yet, and I think that's partly because the definition of the problem is too narrow.
Gracias. Vamos a abrir.
So thank you very much. We're going to give the floor to the audience. We have some questions on Twitter. So, hands up. I see some hands there. Please introduce yourself before speaking. Thank you very much for the presentation. It has been brilliant. I'm Mario Sanchez. I work on international relationships. And my question is, well, fake news affect to the decisions from civil society. I would like to know how it affects afterwards in policy making, in the regulatory framework. And another question is, do you think that the press is a lobby? Thank you. So let's try to pose brief questions, just one, and brief answers, so that we can have a little bit more time.
I'm not sure I understood the first piece of the question. I do think that, or the second piece, actually, unfortunately. I think that the press, you know, certainly has its own set of interests, which you know, sometimes align with sort of the public good in the distribution of information and sometimes don't. I mean, they sometimes align just with their business models. But I don't know if that's totally what you were getting at. I think to the first point, maybe this is appropriate, but on the one hand, legislators and policymakers are a little more impervious to this because they tend to be more in tune to the signals of authority. So, if I'm a member of Congress, I really care what the New York Times says, and I am not going to pay a special amount of attention to Pizzagate. On the other hand, we have a president who literally does the opposite and who is very much in his own information ecosystem and who is captive to a lot of fake news. So I can't offer a lot of reassurance that it's not going to affect American policy at the very highest level, unfortunately.
Otra pregunta y ahora damos paso a Twitter también.
Another question, and we'll give the floor to Twitter. I'll try to be brief. Could you introduce yourself, please? I'm Elena Martin. I work in advertising. And my English is not as good as I would like. There have been some problems with translation, and one of the questions is related to this. My message is not very clear. There has been a research that said that young people has much more facility to know what a fake is from what is not. And I would like to ask you if the relationship with media has changed. We had the message that something on TV was absolutely true. And I said, I saw it on TV as if it was a symptom that it was something certain. And, for example, digital natives are much more aware of the fact that there are no truths, no absolute truths. And the other one has to do with the translation, because you have talked about something related to tribe behavior. So what I would like to ask you is that whether you think that these filter bubbles has a solution, because I think that it links to the need of the human beings of having some certainties, this liquid modernity world where we don't know where to hold. The fact of having these bubbles where reality looks like something certain and foreseeable in some way contributes a value. And this was it. Okay, 3 questions, so let's try to be brief, please.
Well, that was a great question. And I would say yes. I mean, I think there is a silver lining to the way that the internet has changed people's relationship to media and to the truth, for exactly the reason that you say, that it was always a fiction that the media had as strong a hold on the truth as people sometimes believed that it did, and now that fiction has been revealed. On the other hand, I worry about truth bankruptcy, where people say, I don't have time to myself dig into and verify all of these things, and so I'm just not going to care anymore. I think that's part of what you see with some of the kind of trolls, is this sense of kind of like gleeful nihilism where, who knows what's true anymore, so let's just have some fun. I think that's pretty dangerous as well. And to the second piece, yes, I think part of what the filter bubble does is it plays into some very basic desires for simplicity and clarity, and also to a sense of belonging, because I think human beings deeply want to belong to particular tribes, and we view our media through that lens. Is it, for or against my people? That's part of what's reinforcing these algorithmic decisions.
Vamos a dar paso a una pregunta de Twitter.
So let's post a Twitter question. A question from Twitter. It is in English. I'm going to read it. It's from Ignacio Álvaro. I can't open the screen. Please forgive me. I'm going to open up it here.
About those affected by the crisis.
Yes, I think that's what I was arguing earlier. That I think it's very easy to ignore the difficulties and suffering of others. Someone had a sort of prototype of an augmented reality, glasses, where homeless people were sort of edited out. And I feel like that's, the danger of this stuff is, you can, picture a cleaner world in which there are no homeless people. And that doesn't make it so. And, at some point you end up confronting these realities, whether you are imagining that they exist or not. I sort of have this image recently of, if you've ever been someone who's been looking in their phone as they walk across the street and, run into a street sign, you can get very distracted by this thing, but it doesn't change the fact that the street sign's there, and that you need to change course in order to not run into it.
¿Más preguntas en el público? Por ahí una, por ahí otra.
And I'm a PR, so that's the question regarding PR. So did anybody from Google just call you afterwards? You wrote the book, or I don't know if Eric, after you quote him, maybe he did make that phone call. Thanks.
Eric didn't, and the one conversation I had with him, he was not especially interested in discussing it at length. But I did have conversations. I mean, actually, in fairness, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Amazon all kind of invited me in to speak about it. And I think, I'm encouraged by the growing number of both folks at the top. I mean, I think Mark Zuckerberg has made some changes in how he thinks about this, but also folks sort of in the cultures of these companies that are increasingly recognizing that they have this critical role to play. When I went and visited Amazon, I talked to an engineer, and he said, "Thank you for coming and talking to me. Like, I never really thought of what I did as having any kind of ethical connotations or political consequences." And I think for a lot of engineers, they're sort of coming up in a culture that it's just math, and it doesn't really have societal consequences. And I think that's shifted a lot over the last 6 years, and you're starting to see groups organizing within Facebook and within Google to ensure that these companies take this more seriously. And I think that's, as hopeful a thing as anything that I've seen.
Dos preguntas más.
Two more questions. There's somebody over here with in blue, and a few people who want to ask a few more questions over here. Remember to introduce yourself.
My name is Bosco Domingo. I'm about to enter software engineering here in Madrid. And I had a question about the fact that we've reached a point where news might contradict each other, either by warping reality or cherry-picking facts, so you only show one part of the truth, or just altogether making up the facts, creating those fake news. And so what I want to know is, what do you recommend personally that we can do to exit said situation and actually get a whole spectrum and a whole entire view of it, other than just, meeting up with friends and talking to them like, hey, so I saw this article the other day.
Yeah.
What can we do online? Where can we go? What can we do?
That's a great question. I think, probably the best, so the thing that doesn't especially work, that's sort of intuitive, is I'm just going to go seek out some people who have the opposite views from me and follow them on Twitter or follow them on Facebook. And it doesn't work because generally that is both like an unpleasant experience, but also it actually psychologically usually has the impact of further polarizing people. So I follow a far-right blog and I go, yeah, they are racist. I knew it. And it doesn't help me hear any of their ideas. So really what you want to look for is what are called kind of bridge figures, people who have a sympathetic understanding of another point of view, but are also able to interpret it in language that, that is reasonable and that helps you understand, and that have that as kind of their purpose. Ethan Zuckerman, who does great kind of research at MIT, talks about bridge figures when he's talking about sort of cross-cultural understanding, because if you try to read another culture's newspaper, you quickly find yourself sort of lost. Who are these people? What are they talking about? And the same thing is true of, different ideologies. Without these reference points and without some explanation, it's hard to understand why someone might care about that or be focused on that problem. So I think seeking out some bridge figures is one of the best things that I've found. And it is... and then I think the other piece, which is related, is, really trying to bring a spirit of, and kind of strengthen your curiosity. So I think, people often kind of look for other views, kind of almost bracing for a fight. And it's going to be hard not to find a fight if that's what you're looking for. But I think, coming to it with a sense of, well, why might someone think that way? And who is this person, and what is their life like, and how might I understand that yields a different kind of outcome. So I think curiosity, someone said earlier this afternoon, is like one of the most profound and best weapons that we have against this kind of polarization.
Bueno, me dicen que tenemos dos preguntas más. Por aquí
I think we have a couple of questions here. Mike? Me llamo Estefanía, estoy en marketing. Quería saber si hay cierto grado de responsabilidad en los medios con estas noticias falsas.
The concept of news has been a bit degraded due to these new gatekeepers and the algorithms. I think that stuff that shouldn't be news or wouldn't be news some times ago, like if a dress is blue or white or a cat, is now news.
It's blue, by the way.
And now it's news. So the very concept of news has been degraded, and now it's anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a challenge, and I guess, here's the way that I think about it. A lot of us, sort of have lived most of our lives in a world where there was an alliance between kind of having distribution power, having the ability to reach a large audience, and following a particular kind of journalistic process. And some people followed that more or less, but generally there was sort of an accepted premise that if you had this power, you had to follow this process. If you have this process, that's the way you get access to this power. What social media has done is kind of disaggregated these two things. And all of a sudden it's possible to have enormous distribution without ever kind of signing on to the norms of journalism. And so you get this much wider, sort of spectrum of content. And you get a lot of people who are producing stories who, don't feel like they have to follow those norms. And I think you can say, that's not good, and I think there are ways in which it really isn't good. But I think it is the reality that we're walking into, and I think my view is, sort of we need to build both systems that reinforce. I think, for example, you could say to platforms, why don't you create incentives for people who are publishing to those platforms to source their material well. If I source it well, I'm going to get more distribution, and if I don't source it well, I'm going to get less distribution. You can build some of those values without being prescriptive about who gets to speak and who doesn't into these platforms. And I think that's probably part of what needs to happen is kind of reinstantiating, some of the ethics of the old gatekeepers and the new gatekeepers if they're going to be gatekeepers.
La última pregunta por allí también.
Bueno, hola, soy Juan Ruitiña, trabajo en comunicación. Me ha resultado muy...
I work in communication. I think it's very interesting what you've said about confidence and trust that people have in the media. I've also been thinking a few years ago, a couple of years ago, when Twitter banned users or leaders of opinion on the right in the States, there was a loss of confidence from people that extreme towards what they thought was a platform of opinion but it could be Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or so there's also another new web for opinion, which is like a redoubt, a stronghold for the right wing. Is this anecdotic, or should it worry us? Should there be measures adopted to avoid to reduce this fake news and not have certain platforms protecting particular types of opinion?
Yes, I think this points to a great point, which is. I don't think that censorship as a strategy, is very effective, because people will find other channels. And in some ways, I mean, this is kind of a strange anecdote, but once I ended up talking to a bunch of generals and a bunch of militaries about the internet, and the first question that they all had was like, well, how do we turn it off? And like, if something bad happens, we want to turn it off. And I said, like, you really don't want to do that, because that's just going to force conversations that you can engage with and see into places where you can't engage with them or see them. And so I think the same thing applies. You don't really want communities to go away entirely, because in a democracy, like, if you give up on engagement, you really don't have much left. At the same time, though, I do think there's a place for standards of conduct, and I think what the more sophisticated platforms have done is allow that to happen almost invisibly. So, for example, if I use a lot of negative language towards women, maybe I continue to post away thinking I'm bugging a whole bunch of women, but they don't see it at all. There are ways that you could essentially dial down my ability to bother people without it being so obvious to me that that was happening. And that might disincentivize, because I'm looking for a reaction, that kind of behavior. So I think, it's a careful balance, because I think you really don't want people to go away entirely, but you do want to create norms of what's acceptable and what's not.
Muchas gracias, Eli. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to read your next book, maybe. Gracias a todos, también a los que estáis en streaming. Os recuerdo que las charlas Tech Society se van de vacaciones y vuelven en septiembre. Gracias.
Thank you so much.